Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, this is my 500th show for Saga 960. It's amazing that 2 years ago, I started doing this show, the Brian Crombie show on Saga 960, during the federal election of 2019. Saga 960 had recently received a CRTC approval to start broadcasting in Peel. Wanted to appeal to both local issues as well as Greater Toronto issues and national issues. They had some people that were a little bit to the right of me in the morning, and they wanted someone to join them and present a more centrist or progressive or left-wing attitude, albeit I'm not extremely left-wing, but a little bit more progressive attitude in the evening. And I started doing the show, and it has been a ride ever since. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you, my listeners. I know some of you come and go listening to me on the radio or listen to my podcast or listen to and watching my video casts. But it's been a real pleasure. I have had the opportunity over the course of the last year of interviewing some amazing people. And I want to also thank all of those people that have agreed to be interviewed by me. If people that have known me over the years know that I love to meet people and get to know what they're all about, what makes them tick. I've been known to interview people at the dinner table when they come over for dinner. Some people like that, some people don't. But by interviewing people on the radio, and particularly in the last little while, during COVID, when we can do it by video as well, and via the internet around the world, I've really gotten to know people, and I can ask them questions, and I can understand what they're all about. And it's really been an incredible pleasure for me. I'm a pretty social person. I've always been at a bunch of events and liking to meet people involved in politics, involved in the community, and particularly, and I think a lot of the rest of you have probably found this during COVID-19. I went through a little bit of withdrawal, to be candid, in lack of meeting people. And this radio show and my interviewing of different people have really kept me meeting people and enjoying getting to know everyone. And that's been wonderful. To give you a sense of some of the people, during the federal election, I interviewed numerous different federal candidates, both in the 2019 as well as the 2021 federal election campaigns. During the intervening time period, I had the opportunity to interview leaders of the candidates for leadership, almost all of the Conservative candidates for leader, several of the candidates for leader of the Green Party, including Annamie Paul, both before she was elected leader and then after she was elected leader. I had the opportunity during the Conservative leadership to interview Aaron O'Toole and several of the other leaders, and then again Aaron O'Toole after he was elected. I interviewed Elizabeth May. I've interviewed most of the leaders provincially in Ontario. I've interviewed numerous mayors, about a dozen different mayors, and then also several other candidates, people that won and people that didn't win. And during the last election, I was very happy to say that I interviewed a Conservative candidate that won in 905-416 that I thought very highly of, in a suburban area that or urban/suburban area that a lot of people wondered whether any Conservatives could win, and then a Liberal candidate in Aurora that was Conservative, and a lot of people didn't think a Liberal could win. And so two individuals, both very impressive female candidates with great resumes, that bucked the trend and did extremely well. So that's been incredibly enjoyable for me. I've interviewed a whole bunch of business people, economists, business people that are starting new businesses, healthcare people that are inventing vaccines and great therapies to help us. I've interviewed a lot of people from a lifestyle people. I've interviewed a bunch of professors. I've had a couple of interviews with a gentleman that's an expert, Charles Burton, on China. I've interviewed someone who's wrote a book, a professor from the London Business School, on erotic capital. I have had the opportunity to reach out to people I never would have otherwise had the opportunity to chat with, to find out about what they're all about. And today, on my 500th show, I'm going to have a really interesting opportunity to introduce you to Tasha Kheiriddin, who's a principal with Navigator Inc. She's a former Conservative, former president of the Conservative Young Conservative Party, and Marcella Munro, who's a principal with Macmillan Vantage Policy Group. She's a former NDPer. And so it's going to be really fun to have a conversation with people from across the political spectrum about what politics is all about, where we're going as a country, what we expect of the new government. And more importantly, I want to continue this conversation about getting to know people across our political divides. Anyway, thank you all so very much for joining me for the last 2 years, for whatever portion of that that you've been able to. We're going to take a break and come back with Tasha and Marcella in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Thanks again for joining me for my 500th show. It's amazing that I've actually had 500 shows. I've actually got, I think, over 750 shows up on YouTube because obviously for some of my shows, I've interviewed more than one person per show. But 500 shows over 2 years, it's amazing. And I wanted to have a little bit of a conversation because a lot of my shows have been really about understanding people from other businesses, other walks of life, other political parties, etc. And I wanted to invite Tasha Kheiriddin, who has been kind enough to be on the show before. She's a principal with Navigator Inc., a leading high stakes advisory communications firm in Canada. She's a political columnist with the National Post. She's a former broadcast personality. She's a former president of the Young Conservative Party, and a friend of hers, Marcella Munro, who is a principal with Macmillan Vantage Policy Group, which is another organization that does public affairs work. She's a former journalist as well. She's worked in public affairs and communications, and she has been a worker for the NDP. And she worked very closely with the premier in Alberta, NDP, Rachel Notley, who I spoke on Thanksgiving Day with my brother, who lives in Edmonton, by the way, who said, no question, we're going to have an NDP government again because of what's going on. So it was interesting that he had that point of view. So Marcella and Tasha, thank you very much for joining me. How are you two?
As well as can be expected after this election, Brian. That's all I will say.
Well, let's start with that. So, Marcella, maybe I could ask you, what do you think the answer of this election has been? That it shouldn't have been called, or that, you know what, we've had our say and people like minority governments and want them to just get back to work again?
I mean, the election was a bit of a roller coaster, so I don't know that there's a simple answer. You know, there were moments where I thought the Liberals would achieve the majority. There were moments where I thought perhaps Mr. O'Toole was going to be prime minister with a minority government. But at the end of the day, yeah, I think it's fair to say that Canadians, we know that they weren't pleased about the election being called. That feeling never kind of went away the way that it has in other jurisdictions during this pandemic. But B, most importantly, I think the basic feeling is, okay, y'all, we took a look, we did a sniff test on a bunch of you, and at the end of the day, we just need you to get back at it, get back to work. And so I think that's the message loud and clear. And I've said before at other forums, I think the party leadership that takes that signal the most clearly and actually does just want to get back to work for Canadians is going to come out of this the best.
Really, that's interesting. If anyone won, because I think most people lost, if anyone won, it was probably Jagmeet Singh. Is that not correct?
Well, you know, I think that's funny, actually. I don't know, Marcella, you think about Jagmeet because the consensus is they won because they got the balance of power and on certain things. So the Bloc arguably holds it too. And a
slight increase in popular vote. They're the only ones that picked up votes.
But they lost seats, and they, you know, it's like sort of snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. So it's ironic that a lot of the leadership is being contested in terms or questioned in terms of whether, you know, Mr. O'Toole will stay, will Mr. Trudeau take a walk in the snow? Everyone, like you said, kind of lost something. No one's really saying that Jagmeet Singh should go away. So I don't know. I mean, Marcella, you know, what your thoughts are on that, but I find it curious as an observer of that fact.
Marcella?
In some ways, you know, I think the thing is that let's be real here. The NDP, despite what happened to Mr. Mulcair, the NDP doesn't traditionally have a culture of turfing leaders for not winning elections, right? Partly because they've never formed a government federally, and partly because I think the internal politics of the NDP make it slightly more challenging to just wake up one morning and turf a federal leader. It's just, it would be seen, you know, if the caucus, for instance, decided to make moves of that nature, as they kind of tend to do in the Liberal and Conservative parties, that would be very distasteful to membership and cause a lot of outrage. So there's cultural reasons that's not the case. But I don't really see it as a massive victory. Look, they They did hold on. I mean, some analysts would say there was a moment where it was possible the NDP were going to lose a significant amount of seats, and that they, through their campaign, managed to hold on essentially and gain one more. So I guess you can, to Tasha's point, that's kind of snapping victories from the jaws of defeat. And they will play a role in this parliament. So that's important for them. But I don't know that I think they're the winners. I think there are no winners, except for the Canadians won the right to say, get back to work.
Get back to work, and don't bother us with an election, and don't demand that we have a majority government just because you want to have full control. Marcella, I want to ask you, I don't know if you read it, but Tasha did an interesting article on the front page of the National Post about what the Conservative Party needed to do become more relevant, because Erin O'Toole really was trying to appeal to the 905 and the equivalent to the 905, the suburbs around Vancouver, and failed and didn't win. You know, I'm calling you from Mississauga. The radio show that we're on is from Peel, and they didn't win any seats in Mississauga or Brampton, not one. And most people thought that if they were going to win minority, they had to win half, and majority, more than half of the seats in Mississauga, Brampton. And as you probably know, in 2011, they won almost all of the seats in Mississauga and Brampton, and then lost them all in 2015. And so 905, particularly, I want to feel more relevant. Mississauga and Brampton is really a bellwether of who's going to win. Who's going to win government. And Erin O'Toole was not able to do better than Andrew Scheer in that regard. And she says that the Conservatives need to appeal more to new Canadians, and more suburban voters, and centralize, if not become more progressive with a bunch of their policies. What do you think?
Well, typically smart take from my friend Tasha. Quite brave of her, in my view, to enter the fray so quickly with a kind of hot take, where a lot of her colleagues were probably like, "Ugh." But I think it's the right one. Look, I mean, to your point, it's not just the 905, it's the Lower Mainland in Vancouver. Those also have become essentially swing suburban ridings, right? And so the Conservatives haven't taken that challenge, I don't think, quite as seriously as they need to. I think a piece of the puzzle is definitely their disconnection from these immigrant new Canadian populations. They haven't made, I don't think, a serious effort there. I think we saw from some, Clean Prosperity did a massive exit polling almost recently. And I'm on the advisory board, full disclosure, but Clean Prosperity, our only goal is to get all of the parties aligned with some kind of carbon pricing. And our exit study basically said, look, if you think that dumping the carbon pricing mechanism or that changing the inroads O'Toole managed to make on those issues was a mistake, you're wrong, because the accessible voters in the Conservative universe like that policy. They want a serious climate policy. They don't believe it can be without a carbon price. Now, where we can disagree, and we will, is how you use that money, right? For Conservatives, they want to give it back in tax cuts. I think there's way more interesting things we could do with it. But that being said, I think they're really in a battle for the heart and soul of the Conservatives, and I think that's a surprising outcome of this election. It once again was the second or third election where the Conservatives are still grappling with who they want to be when they grow up.
Who they want to be when they grow up. That's an interesting take. Tasha, let me turn it around and ask you about the NDP. Jagmeet Singh, I thought, ran a good campaign. They spent a lot of money. They did a lot of advertising. I thought he performed extremely well in the leaders' debate. And some people were thinking that the NDP would be not a factor at all in the election campaign. And in the end, I think they were a factor in the election campaign. But did they win many seats out of sort of urban Canada? No. And they've got to also win more seats in urban Canada, as well as obviously win some seats in suburban Canada. And in the 905, and I don't know this everywhere, but certainly in Mississauga and Brampton, they didn't come second in one seat. And they didn't come close to second in one seat. They were far back third in every single, and they had some really good candidates. I interviewed a few of them. What do you think the NDP and Jagmeet Singh have to do if they want to grow anywhere close to what Jack Layton did?
Well, I think it's interesting you know that they were the third place performer here. I think that that's one of the factors for why the Liberals won. I think that the Liberals actually depend on that split to be really much more in their favor in terms of the progressive vote. And I think for the NDP, one of the things that might have crushed them in the 905 is the sense that the O'Toole vote was rising. The NDP always, loses or does not do as well when the Conservatives look like they're going to form government, and then people rush back to the Liberals, which is, I think, what happened. So to say, how could you break through in that same market the Conservatives need to break through in? You have to out appeal, or you have to be more appealing than the Liberals. So the challenge for the NDP is different. The Conservatives have to sort of get to the voters they haven't reached yet, who are not on their, who are maybe skeptical of them, see them as maybe anti-immigrant, or they see them as too rural, or they don't see them as disconnected on things like guns, for example. I think the NDP's challenge is they've got to convince Liberal voters that they are actually the better option. So they're going after the same people that would be supporting, similar policies to Justin Trudeau as the policies in this election, but they have to say, look, it's not enough to just send us as the conscience. We have to also have seats if we're going to actually impact. So if people want a minority government, in fact, that's a selling point they can have and say, look, don't worry, you'll get your minority government. You can vote NDP. It's safe to vote NDP because it still won't, the Liberals will still be in a minority. Give us a few more seats, give us a say. It could also come down to individual candidates. Like you said, sometimes you have people who are, former mayors or really well-known councillors, or people who have a local appeal who could do that. I think the NDP has to source those people. I don't know who the candidates were in Mississauga, but it would seem to me that that's a fact they could also try and mine because they do a lot of local politics in Toronto proper. A lot of councillors in downtown Toronto I know are very much in the side of the NDP.
Run federally as well and have a big influence federally as well.
Yeah.
Marcella, has Jagmeet Singh's hand weakened because he can't actually vote the government out of power? No one wants another election again for probably another 2, if not frankly 4 years. And so therefore the threat that he had for the last 2 years of voting against and the argument that he had that he kept them in power. And so therefore he had the balance of power. It's gone, hasn't it? He can't vote them out now. No one can be seen as the person that triggers an election.
That's true. But look, none of the opposition parties were going to trigger election anytime soon anyway. And they were still managing to push Liberal buttons on key issues. I think Jagmeet's biggest challenge, and it will come to bear in this parliament as well, is, as I've said to friends who don't want to hear it, but I'm much more typically a kind of progressive voter who looks at the Liberals and NDP and kind of makes my mind up. And so the question becomes, federally anyway, provincially is a different story, but federally, I think the thing is, how do you take on a government which you could make the argument, which I have, is possibly the most and the best social democratic government we've had in Canadian history? Because I don't think you can look at what the Liberals have done, particularly through COVID, and say that they weren't there to support workers, they didn't find a way to make sure people's incomes were protected, that they weren't supporting the provinces, making sure people weren't getting evicted. Now, you can argue that some of that was due to the fact that they were, negotiating / listening to the NDP to make sure their voters could be in the tent to make sure they get those votes in the House. But you can't argue that they didn't pursue those options and get things done. And then when you look at the more social issues, they have been vocal on abortion rights. They are willing to go there on gun control. Like, there's just a lot of issues that this Liberal government has managed to take off the table, where in the past, the NDP could have had a little bit more wiggle room to, make a contrast.
Tasha, listen to what she said. The most socially democratic government in Canadian history.
I'm holding my tongue.
That should have been something that Aaron O'Toole and the Conservatives could have attacked, couldn't they? And you think about Harper and how he attacked the idea of coalition. We've actually ended up not with a coalition, but with a minority government supported by the NDP, had what Marcella calls the most socially democratic government in Canadian history.
Social democratic. I didn't say socialist. They did try that attack and it didn't work, Brian.
Yeah.
So, Canadians don't mind hearing that, because when you're talking about a European social democratic approach, I think most Canadians, a majority at least, probably don't find that very scary. Sorry, Tash.
No, that's fine. And it's interesting because on certain things, the social democrats in Europe are actually further, I would say to the right, but in my view, have got it right on healthcare, for example, where you have mixed system. You have what we call here 2-tier, but in fact is choice. You go to Sweden, far more social democratic country than Canada, and you have that choice. And when Aaron O'Toole was on the campaign trail, when that came out with that, that clumsy Twitter ad, then Twitter censored and said he had been taken out of context and all this stuff. He in fact walked away from that argument. I thought that was ironic because you could paint it in those terms. and say, you know, this is actually something Europe is very comfortable with. Why aren't we? I think, though, to go back to the, you know, social democratic government, I think O'Toole did try a little, but that, you know, that hardcore, I guess, painting in ideological terms appeals more to the further right you go in the Conservative Party, or dare I say the People's Party. They will say, you know, Canada's turning into a communist country because people have to take vaccines. It's kind of awful language. You don't want to go into that trap. I think, though, that there are elements, the NDP, you know, the Liberals routinely steal their stuff because they know it helps them get votes. And we've seen that, we may see that on pharmacare. That's an issue that the NDP is very strong on. I don't think we'll see it in the fall economic statement, but maybe in the budget, they will be pushing for that to give their support.
So this has been a great conversation about the election. Why don't we take a break and then change to exactly what Tasha's talking about, the future, what we expect from this government. So we've left the past behind us. We're going to move on to the future. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Tasha Kheiriddin and Marcella Munro. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. And I keep mentioning it, it's probably irrelevant to everyone but me, but this is my 500th show. 500 shows over 2 years. It's amazing. And I've been joined by Marcella Munro. She's a principal with Macmillan Vantage Policy Group. She's a former journalist. She's been working in public affairs and communication strategy for over 15 years. She's worked for the NDP in political circles, both BC and Alberta, and former Vancouver Mayor Gregor Robertson, who was someone who I really thought highly of. She also worked with. Tasha Kheiriddin is a principal with Navigator Limited, Canada's leading high-stakes advisory and communications firm. She's the national political columnist for the Post Media chain of newspapers, where she writes weekly a current affairs issue. She also lectures at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University and serves as the vice president of the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation. And what I love is that the two of you met, I understand, when you were on the same show. Is that correct?
It is true.
100%.
Full disclosure.
Tandem.
And we were much younger then. It's been actually just over 20 years. It was 1998. And the program was called Counterspin on what was then News World, CBC News World, which now is, you know, it's 3 incarnations later. But yes, that was, and we were ideological opposites, but we became really great friends. And I think that's something the world needs more of, quite frankly.
I think the world needs more of this. A song, I think, with that line in it.
Probably is. Yeah.
Marcella, I saw today a poll that came out that showed that almost every premier in Ontario and Canada was down by like 20 points. And the premier that's down the most is actually the premier of Alberta. And so it seems like during most of COVID, you know, the premiers and the leaders were doing, not just in Canada, but worldwide, well, if they were, you know, people were supporting their governments through COVID. But in the last little while, things have changed dramatically and people are demanding a lot more of their governments. And obviously Premier Kenney, but also Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, et cetera, the premiers are down dramatically. Actually, it's interesting, ironic that the only premier that's doing okay right now is Premier Ford in Ontario. But what this says is that people are really questioning government. So let's talk about the federal government and what it's got to do. What do you think the key things in the federal economic statement, the speech from the throne, are going to be about? What do you think they should be about?
Well, you know, it's a big challenge, right? And I think there's been some good writing, not just for Canada, but the Western world, about what happened to our leaders during COVID and how they kind of at first, because most Western governments, the federal Canadian government included, acted very quickly to support people, to make sure their economies didn't fully collapse, to make sure there were worker protections for workers that were vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a result, all these governments saw a big boost in their popularity at first. I think the challenge now is we're 2 years into this. People are sick and tired of hearing about it. But on the other hand, people are not stupid and they realize that we're in the middle of a fourth wave now. And so we're not quite out of the woods yet. And so we're even a more tricky wicket, I feel like, for politicians. And I think that's part of why a lot of them are losing popularity, because no one has a simple answer to when is this really going to go back to normal? And what kind of things do we need to do to get there? So I think that all of that being said, the challenge for the feds going into the fall economic statement, they're now going to have to, I think, start to present the picture of what getting back to some fiscal discipline might look like, while at the same time not freaking out small businesses and vulnerable populations that they're going to suddenly lose all supports. So that's a really tough balancing act. You know, we're going to see COP26 start in a couple of weeks. Climate change is now rocketing to the top of people's concerns. When you look at recent polling, it's actually surpassed COVID in some polls. And that's because we came through a brutal summer where climate change was very in our face. And so they're going to have to be ready to be aggressive on that file. And then thirdly, I would think this childcare issue is not going to, you know, they've got to somehow get this started in a much quicker fashion, because when they were talking about it before the election, they were like, oh, you know, it will probably impact people in 2 or 3 years. We lost so much workforce participation from mothers, from women in COVID. We can't afford as an economy to have those women sitting on the sidelines. But I also understand, I'm not a mother myself. They don't want to come back in the economy without knowing their children are safe. And that means better childcare. So I think those are 3 top of mind big issues with Liberals.
So social issues primarily to address some of these issues that people are worried about and to make sure that you get the NDP support.
Well, yeah, but also I do think this budget challenge is a real one. We're starting to see inflation actually, you know, be a problem or a potential problem. I don't think the fiscal, you know, someone's got to come up with something about how we get back to some kind of fiscal balance. And
so Tasha, you know,
I've been an idea on that yet.
I've been amazed that the Conservatives haven't been talking about that more, and they sort of bailed on it during the election with this, you know, we're not going to have to balance the budget for 10 years. As you probably know, the IMF just today came out and announced that they're worried about global growth because of supply chain issues. And they said that they think that growth is going to be lower than they previously thought. Inflation is going to be higher than they previously thought, and that unemployment is still high. So if you have high inflation, low growth, and high unemployment, isn't that 1970s stagflation again?
I was just going to say, it's back to the 70s. Here we go.
I love the music, but I don't think I like stagflation.
No one likes stagflation, but yes, there is that possibility. However, I think one of the issues really will be the rate of growth, and this notion that, and you know, Trudeau even before the pandemic was famous for saying that the budget will balance itself, will just grow the economy. I think to Marcella's point, I both agree and disagree on what lies ahead. I think the Delta variant was the problem. The Delta variant was something people hadn't. You know, there was a plan to get out of COVID. There was a plan to roll out vaccines. The Delta variant put the kibosh on that. And that's why you see the situation in Alberta. That's why you see the situation in Saskatchewan, because governments there acted as if Delta was not a thing. And it was. And so that changed the dynamics. However, and that put a wrench into growth. The other thing that's put a wrench into growth is labor market supply. Everyone is complaining. Small businesses, large business are complaining that they cannot find workers. Certain sectors like hospitality and agriculture are really badly affected. And that has to do in part with, changes to what people's expectations are for work, but also to pandemic supports. So there is, I think, going to be in this budget coming forward and the fall economic statement, there'll be continuation of financial support for for business rather, from government. I think that definitely things like the hiring benefit and the wages benefit and rent, that's going to continue to try and help business stay around to hire people. But will pandemic supports for individuals, will that get a new renewal? If it does, it'll be less than it is now, because there is a recognition that it has actually been a disincentive for some people in certain sectors to go back to jobs that, let's be honest, didn't pay that much. And were not necessarily jobs people wanted to necessarily do for, it wasn't their fulfillment in life. So they're questioning and they're saying, well, I don't have to because I have CRB. So that's an issue. The other issue I will disagree with Marcella on is the back to balance. At Navigator, we did a significant amount of research during the election and post-election. We asked voters, Liberal voters, what are your concerns? Balancing a budget was low on the totem pole. Nobody actually really cared. It is really actually scary as a conservative to look at that, because I think it is a big.
I don't think it's a voter concern, but the bond markets are going to come.
Oh yes, 100%.
Yeah.
Eventually, some piper is going to come calling, but the government may ride it out for as long as it can electorally, because it knows people want, to your point, Marcella, they want the childcare delivered. They want action on climate change. They're not sure what, but they want something to happen. So I think government's going to focus on those and keep spending, unfortunately.
But if we have inflation going up, interest rates are going to have to go up. And as interest rates go up, that debt is going to take a larger and larger percentage of the federal budget, and there's going to be less money available. And so the only way to solve that problem is to reduce expenditures. And so at some point in time in the future, you're going to have some fiscal discipline, aren't you?
One hopes. One hopes, yes. I think you will. Whether it's forced, like it was for Chrétien in the 90s, the IMF came calling and they had to do something, or whether growth will actually exceed expectations and the government will get lucky and be able to sort of tip that balance more gently as opposed to any kind of radical austerity.
I just would have thought that the Conservatives would have been so much more focused on this issue.
I think maybe it's because they also were doing similar view that the balanced budget orthodoxy is not, even before the pandemic, was a lot less of an issue for them and for voters than it was previously. And you see this, it's cyclical. I think it'll come back, but I don't think it's fully back yet.
You had said, Tasha, that you were worried about the growth of both the Maverick Party in the West as well as the PCP. Is that something that the Conservatives still have to be worried about, or is that day gone?
No, I think they still do. I think they do. I think the pandemic contributed a lot to the People's Party growth. Maxime Bernier said that he doesn't, he thinks that it's not going to be, once it's gone, it won't be a factor. He'll continue on his campaign there. But I think that as long as it's around, this anti-government sentiment is what's feeding it. And that has been channeled by pandemic measures. So as long as pandemic measures, you have headlines of people losing their jobs in healthcare because they're not getting vaccinated and it's mandatory, that every time that happens, he gets another supporter somewhere.
Marcella, the PCP got twice as many votes as the Green Party. And even the Conservatives have now accepted that climate change is man-made and or somewhat man-made, and have adopted a carbon tax as one of their policies. In that kind of a world, do you still need a Green Party?
Well, I don't think we have a Green Party right now that's functional. So I don't know how relevant it is to talk about them. They're in the middle of suing their former leader and she's suing them back. And, they have 2 seats in the House. So but to the point, I don't know. I think Canadians now, you could argue that the Green Party's job is kind of done. For years, they were the ones saying this climate change, the environment was and should be at the center of policymaking. I guess they've been proven right in many ways. And so, yeah, to your point, like all the parties, all the main parties on the stage now have climate change policies. I think they missed a big opportunity. This could have been their year in some ways. I think most accounts, most analysis by climate economists and those who do that kind of work was that the Liberals came out with the strongest plan on climate change by a long shot, and that the NDP actually were third behind the Conservatives in terms of the detail of their plan. And so you've got to think that if the Green Party had been more functional and you had some people around that table that were more concentrated on how do we have a climate plan that is even more aggressive than what the Liberals are going to produce, that they could have made a bigger splash, but instead they were busy infighting. And so I think it's too bad, because we probably do need that voice on that end of this issue to keep challenging us on what we're doing and how fast we're doing it. But right now, I don't see who that voice is. I mean, the problem with the NDP federally is they don't have a very sophisticated view of how we're going to take our natural resource economy and transition into being better climate leaders. And that's really unfortunate.
So if you've got the most social democratic party government in Canadian history, you've got a Liberal government that is supporting climate change, supporting national daycare, childcare, potentially supportive of pharmacare, has actually tried out, test marketed over the course of the last year, a guaranteed annual income. Do you still need an NDP?
Again, to me, it's about the NDP understanding in a more serious way what their value is and how they should proceed in this parliament. So, for example, I think that there is some room on the childcare issue to really continue to be aggressive with the Liberals. Listen, we've had these promises and half implementation from the Liberals since I was in my 20s, so it's been 20 years. I don't know how they're exactly going to follow through, but they will need to be held to account every step of the way. We already see them playing this kind of game of chicken in the media with Ontario. Well, if you can't get your childcare policy passed in Ontario, have you really helped the country? You could argue you have not. It's where 40% of the population lives. So I do think, again, just like the Greens, there's some opportunities there, the NDP, but they need to be more crystal about what those opportunities are. Transportation would be another one. I mean, we haven't even touched on that, but that's a major infrastructure challenge for Canada going forward.
Tasha, what about the PCP and the Maverick? Do you think they'll hang around, or will they dissolve back into the Conservative Party?
I think that they will hang around. As I said a bit earlier, I think the pandemic gave them that boost because it accentuated the role of government. That both parties really are a representation of, I would say, the furthest right in terms of, libertarian or a small government view. They're basically, I know less about the Maverick in terms of their ultimate ends, but Bernier's party is really a vehicle for him. He was always pretty, a libertarian guy. He on social issues and other things, though, he's gone, I would say, off the deep end in terms really of like the anti-vax stuff and the sense that, government he wants calling for revolution and like really far more radical discourse than he ever did when I knew him at the Montreal Economic Institute. In fact, I took over his job bizarrely after I wrote a book and was, headhunted. He got elected to Parliament, and so they needed someone to be vice president of the Montreal Economic Institute, which is a right of center think tank in Montreal. And I met him then, 15 years ago, and he wasn't like this. He was the guy who believed in small government, but nothing like this. So I think he is the driving force too. As long as he's around, the party will be around. But the Conservatives have work to do. Like you said, it's not a question of getting those people back in the fold. I think it's more expanding and saying, what do we stand for? What are Conservative values? How do they resonate with new Canadians, with people who are more, like you said, in the markets like the 905 suburbs? And the other people who are in the People's Party, courting them on the basis of what their anger is, I don't think is an answer for the Tories. So short answer, they'll be around. Eventually, their grievances may change, and the pandemic's gone. Maybe it'll be less than it is now.
One of the reasons I love. Go ahead.
Sorry, the Conservatives have a major problem in Alberta, right? Because we know that a lot of that anger is really focused there. And this is why the UCP, the party of Jason Kenney, is falling apart. And so that will allow some of what you're talking about to fester in a major way as that party kind of dissolves into who knows how many splitter groups.
One of the reasons why I really I'm honored that the two of you joined me for my 500th show is one of the things that I've tried to do is I've really tried to reach out to people with different views and get those views expressed on my show. And from what I understand, you guys have come from opposite ends of the political spectrum, and you've argued and you've talked and you still like each other. And that is wonderful. I want to take a break and come back with some concluding comments. Maybe you can think about it during our break about how we can get the rest of Canada to talk to, listen to, and be accepting of, if not, frankly, friends with people from other political stripes. Because it's something that seems certainly has stopped to happen in the United States, and I worry is happening more and more in Canada. This partisan divide, this echo chamber that we only talk to and listen and party with and associate with people that think the same way that we are. Take a break. We're going to come back more with Marcella Munro and Tasha Kheiriddin in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. And as I bored you about on several occasions, it is my 500th show. And I'm so I can't believe I've done 500 of these. And I'm honored to have Tasha Kheiriddin and Marcella Munro, two political commentators for more than a couple of decades each that have joined me. Tasha, historically a conservative, and Marcella, historically an NDPer, and me, historically a liberal. And so it's interesting that the three of us have had, I think, an interesting and good conversation today. Tasha, you were saying that the two of you met each other when you were first on a show together, and you you were arguing against each other because you were on something where you were supposed to be of representing different points of view, but you became respectful of and liked each other and have remained friends. How do you do that? And why can't more people do that across the political spectrum in Canada today?
Well, I'll start, and then Marcella can finish my words, because that's actually how I think our friendship kind of evolved. We worked together on this show. We were sometimes on it too. It's called Counterspin, and we were, but we were offset as well and working to put the show to air. So we had to listen to each other. We had to hear out because we had to be the counterpoint, and we had to find guests that were the counterpoint. And in doing so, for me, it was a real education. I mean, Marcella, you described yourself as an anarcho-syndicalist back then. I had to look up the term. I was like, what is that?
To wind people up, but yeah, for sure.
But it was our youth. It was in our youth. And I would have been, full confession, in my high school yearbook, I had a little quote that said, "What is right is never wrong. Viva Tory power." Okay. So that gives you a sense of how, I'd never really been exposed to that extent, to the other point of view. And in listening to it and having to listen to it in a respectful way, because your colleagues, right? It educated me, and even it confirmed some of my beliefs, but it also opened my eyes to why other people felt the way they did, and the need to have that dialogue, and how important it is to keep an open mind and listen, even if you don't agree.
Rachel, how do we get Canadians to do this more often?
Well, I think, my recollection is the same as Tasha's, right? And so I had come, after my first few years after university, I actually did work for the labor movement. I worked for Bob White at the Canadian Labour Congress. And so we indeed were both kind of, I guess, a little bit like a lot of Canadians find themselves. We were both kind of in our own bubbles, right? We were both working in environments where our basic value systems were never questioned. And if they were, we could write them off, as you do nowadays on social media, and you just start to chip away at who you're exposed to. And so I think one of the great lessons of my life, and I'm so glad I took that opportunity to go work for the CBC, because Tasha's become one of my best friends. And I think that it is because we both agreed willingly, but there were moments when that conversation was difficult, but we, got to know each other as people, which is, I think, the big challenge, right? Is to, even if people have different point of view from you, doesn't mean they aren't great people who you might have a lot in common with in terms of art and music and, love of your family, or different things you like to do, like go on big nature hikes. We share a lot of other things. And I think that allowed us to keep grounded, so that when we were disagreeing, we understood it. It's not that we didn't agree because either of us was a bad person or were malicious in any way, shape, or form. I think we've also both tried to be quite diplomatic and thoughtful in how we approach politics. So I don't think you would see either of us out there attacking anyone personally. So I think that personal attack stuff that social has wrought on the culture has been quite problematic. But I just think there's nothing like having a coffee. And look, there are people out there who really do hate folks, but mostly they're anonymous voices on social. I don't think it's hard to find someone who you could disagree with that you would still enjoy having a drink or a coffee with, and that's the challenge.
So the lesson of your friendship, and both of you are probably better people because of your exposure to and knowledge of each other's views, is to have a coffee, drink, or a nature walk with a socialist or a right winger.
Or a liberal. We don't want to leave you out of the picture, Brian.
Yeah, exactly. The middle has to be there too. I think though, with that personal connection though, I will echo that. I think Marcella's right. I think we've lost a lot. It's easy to be angry on social media when you never see someone in the flesh. It's harder when they're, when their workstation's next to you, or you're, socializing. It's much harder. So that human piece, I think we have to work at that. It's hard in COVID. It's hard, but it's critical to building any kind of understanding.
Well, Marcella, I heard a cute story from Tasha about you, that you came back from Italy with a Prada bag, and she thought that and she thought that you were a sellout to whatever, and you quickly said, yeah, but it was a union factory.
Well, it's true. So listen, I don't, as you can see, I'm a fan of contemporary art. I don't. I've worked very hard for the things that I have. I pay taxes. I would pay more taxes for the services Canadians need. To me, that's never been about denying myself something I might want that's material, but it's about living my values in all the ways I can, whether that's being there for a friend. I try to donate a lot to charity. I try to give my time to charitable organizations. And I think most Canadians are like that. I think the vast majority of Canadians aren't greedy and selfish, and it doesn't matter if they enjoy, a good pair of shoes or a nice car. You can't judge people from that kind of stuff, because having lived and worked in Calgary, by the way, honestly, working with oil and gas executives, some of the most generous people I've ever had the ability to work with. So you just don't know. And writing off people because of their status, whether one way or the other, it's just like, you can't also say, go into a meat plant, which some of the toughest jobs, people are lowest paid. You wouldn't go in there and say, well, these people are all rough and gross because this is their job. Because again, many of them are just good family people, heavily involved in their communities, etc.
I think it's a lesson that we all need to hear. And I got to tell you that this past 2 years, I've had the opportunity to interview both Jagmeet Singh as well as his brother, who's a MPP in the Ontario legislature, who's very impressive, articulate gentleman. And I've gone to several hockey games with Andrew Scheer and Maxime Bernier, and enjoyed chatting with them as well as Jean Chrétien. And so there is something about we've got to go out for drinks, coffee, and nature walks with people that are different from us. Anyway, I really want to thank the two of you, Tasha Kheiriddin and Marcella Munro, for joining me on my 500th show. And I want to tell everyone that I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. You can get all my podcasts and videocasts on briancrombie.com, on YouTube, on podcasts on Audible, on Speakeasy, and check me out sometime. And Tasha and Marcello, thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.